podcast, Meeting You Where You're At, featuring Richard Juknoborian, UMASS Lowell Zuckerberg College of Health Science graduate, class of 1998, and Guest Angela Liu, Director of Strategy and Growth at Hack Diversity. I'm Amy Lee, and I am the Senior Associate Director of Alumni and Donor Engagement at UMASS Lowell. And this is a live podcast event in collaboration with the UML Innovation Hub Haverhill and the Alumni and Donor Relations Office. We're recording in person from the Innovation Hub in Haverhill, but we want to recognize our alumni and friends who are watching virtually, as well as our UMass Lowell students participating virtually from the Social Justice Center and the Asian American Center for Excellence and Engagement on our Lowell campus. If you are watching online, please feel free to enter questions during the podcast into the chat box. We are so excited to provide this important and timely program, especially as it demonstrates the varied and entrepreneurial ways that our UMass Lowell alums use their talents and education to make a positive impact in the community. Thank you for joining us, and I'd like to introduce Stephanie Guyot, Associate Director of the Innovation Hub Haverhill, who will welcome our speakers.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Rija and Mina, for being here and collaborating with us on this event. We're really excited to welcome everybody to the Innovation Hub here in Haverhill, and also to welcome our virtual audience. This is one of the many type of programs that we do here at the iHub. The Innovation Hub is a business incubator and co-working space. We support startups, small businesses, and early stage entrepreneurs by providing them facility, programming, support, mentoring, and a prototyping lab. So all the things they can do to grow and launch their business successfully here in Haverhill and the Merrimack Valley. So we're really thrilled to be able to have this year. This event's really, I'm excited for this. This is something that Richard and I started talking about a few months ago, and Richard wears many hats in his connection to UMass Lowell, which is just wonderful. He's an alum, as you heard. He is also a member here at the Innovation Hub, where he's an entrepreneur and a startup founder, as well as a healthcare technology executive in his day job. And Richard started this podcast in 2020, where he wanted to build a platform to amplify women entrepreneurs, founders, and CEOs that were focused on social impact and innovation. So I said to Richard, I want to do that live in person at the iHub. And he said, sure. And then we said, now we need a dynamic and amazing guest. And thanks to a connection that we have with Jeff Busking, who is one of the co-founders of Hack Diversity, Jeff introduced us to Angela, and we're just so excited that Angela immediately agreed to be part of this. And we've had an exciting conversation ahead of time in sort of prepping for this. So I think you're all in for a real treat. And I will just give a quick intro about Angela. But again, thank you for being here. We're really excited for this conversation. The podcast will also be recorded and turned into a podcast, so you can catch up online. You can share it with anybody who isn't with us live in person or live online tonight. So that's very exciting. Angela Liu brings a decade-long record of progressive and responsible impact at the intersection of equitable STEM, workforce development, economic mobility, and corporate responsibility. At Hack Diversity, Angela has scaled program strategy and operations to power a network of more than 400 fellows and 50 plus big companies in Boston. And we're just thrilled to have them here today. And I'm really excited to turn this over to Richard, who's going to run our show for tonight.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you so much. And thank you, Angela, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
That was such a lovely introduction, and I hope I live up to expectation.
I think you're going to do great. How are you liking Haverhill?
It's lovely. There's a lot of space here that's very different from being cramped in Boston, wherever I live. So I have to come out here more often.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's kind of nice. We've got this beautiful view of the river here, which is A little hard to see now that the sun sets at 3:30 in the afternoon.
Right,
but
right.
It's really lovely. And you might not know this, but Haverhill, because you have really cool shoes on, so I'm going to mention that for a minute. But Haverhill is the shoe city. At one time, something like 10% of the shoe production in the United States took place right here in this city. So it's very fun fact history. Yeah, so we'll start with a fun fact for everybody listening. So awesome. Well, we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion tonight, and really about the need for equity, the need for equitable organizations, the need for diversity in workplaces. And clearly, Hack Diversity is a leader in that space. You've done a lot of thought leadership yourself in that space. I'll kind of jump right in if that's okay with you. And, you know, a lot of organizations will say, well, you know, the best ideas come from the ground up. So we're going to put this onus on our employees, right? We're going to ask the employees to take a leadership here in driving DEI initiatives, right? This is a grassroots effort, but is that enough? I'm curious as to your thoughts as to where do the employees' responsibility to create the place of work that they want to be in end, and where does the employer's responsibility to provide that environment, sort of, where's the cross-section there, and what have you seen?
Yeah, absolutely. If I may, I would love to just give an overview of Hack Diversity.
Sure,
and
absolutely.
Kind of how we work and how we work with employer partners. Because I think something really unique about what we've built, and I give full credit to Jody and Jeff, our co-founders, Jody Rose and Jeff Busking, our co-founders, who brought me on to think about something that I was frustrated with before coming to Hack. I was mostly working on the student end when it comes to upskilling. And their ground zero intention was, how can we think about doing this on the partner end as well as the employers end? What is their responsibility there for employers to break down systems? So Hack Diversity, the mission is to transform the economy by breaking down barriers for Black and Latina professionals in tech. And we do that very intentionally, both on the fellows side. Our fellows are predominantly self-identifying as Black or Latina, pursuing first careers in the tech economy. And our employer partners, they're joining us already believing in the value of racial equity, diversity, and inclusion, but maybe struggling with how can they implement that sustainably across the employee life cycle. And that's where Hack comes in to support those efforts. So back to your question related to where's the responsibility, the division?
Division of responsibility, yeah.
I almost see it in the way I think Hack has crafted it is that there's a lot of feedback loops, right? Because it requires a community in all employee participation. I definitely think it needs to be ground up from is this effective? Right. Is our values being translated to the belonging experienced by employees, and especially by employees who might historically be most marginalized or underrepresented? And how do we make sure we're consistently kind of auditing to center those experiences? Because when Black employees win, everybody wins, right? So I think that weather vane needs to be a constant feedback loop. But I also think leadership has a responsibility to participate in that themselves, create the vision, and be accountable to that vision, and be receptive to feedback and how we can continue driving forward. So I do think it's a good check and balance and feedback loops. I don't think to me, my perspective is that there's no clear division.
Right.
It's more like a call and response. And how do we make sure we're, what the leadership is stating they want is being translated and converted to the experience.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of what Hack's work is with our employer partners. How do we support you and be an accountability partner for employer partners to translate those values into the employee experience?
And what would that engagement partnership or engagement agreement look like between Hack and your employment partners? Does it vary depending upon the situation, the goals, the objectives of what they're trying to do? Or there probably is no typical engagement, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure. But what traditionally, what do those engagements look like for Hack?
Yeah, so we have a 9-month engagement. Our fellowship model, our program model is a 9-month fellowship. We work with the fellows 9 months, with the partners 9 months. And the partners in particular engage in a series of racial equity, diversity, and inclusion programming in which they themselves go through it in a cohort. So there's a lot of interactive peer knowledge exchange, a lot of sharing on this is what worked, this is what isn't working, these are the blockers, how do we navigate these blockers? We want to do all these new things, but how do we stop doing old things? Right. So with our employer partners, we one thing that we, or two things I think that have been more insightful and enlightening. One is looking at the interview process, in particular the technical interview process, and how do we make sure when we're thinking about that, we can reconfigure it in a way that is more inclusive to alternative education pathways
Sure.
outside of a typical 4-year CS degree, and pivoting that towards skills-based, because there's a lot of data out there that shows that the technical interview is kind of essentially a grab bag.
Right.
The same person can perform really well in one interview and really poorly in another, and it's not, even if you have a traditional background, like even if you are an MIT graduate, right? So that's an aspect that we work with employers to think about, hey, is there a way we can break this interview process apart and reconfigure it in a way to be more inclusive? And then the second layer of that we think about that's really important is the inclusive management piece.
Sure.
So how can our employer partners, the people who are closest to the fellow experience, be very mindful around clarity on goal setting, giving feedback, constructive feedback, developmental feedback, positive feedback, and making sure that there is that responsibility and investment in their growth, in their continuing professional trajectory. So I guess like just zooming out a little bit, if I can just break it down, we look at our already programming from an individual and interpersonal and organizational level. But I do think it needs to start from the individual.
Sure.
And then as we get into the organizational lens, like how are we codifying it into processes? So promotion processes, hiring processes, evaluation processes, who gets to lead projects, and that kind of decision making. Where does budget fall?
Come into place.
Who has a voice in product development? So translating that individual learning into the codified process of the organization.
And you mentioned the fellowship aspect of it, the partnership aspect of it. How does that process begin? How does someone kind of approach Hack Diversity? Or are they approached, or do you approach fellows? Curious as to how that kind of comes together from the, hey, I'm an employer, I want to work with Hack Diversity, I'm potentially interested in being part of your fellowship. How does that recruitment process go, and how do people enter the world there?
Yeah, so we have an amazing, passionate team, our fellow success team, who leads in recruitment.
Okay.
We focus our active recruitment efforts, meaning we're like physically going out and trying to develop relationships with talent partners on what we observe to be underestimated and undervalued education pathways. So the public education system, the community college system, the boot camps, continuing education programs.
Sure.
So as the nature of that focus, our fellows, the age range actually is late teens, maybe 19, all the way up to mid-50s,
Wow.
year over year.
Wow.
Because again, we're investing in the alternative education pathways.
Sure.
And really encouraging our partners to look at skills-oriented evaluation, not paper
Education,
and
paper,
degree,
yep.
as the key indicator for filtering out candidates into the pool. So we do our active recruitment, but also I would say we track how our prospective fellows are hearing about us, and our alumni are actually our biggest ambassadors.
Recruiters,
right?
ambassadors, yeah,
So
fans.
because we can say, Hack is great all we want,
Right.
but ultimately we work with an organization, we have an interest there, there's bias there. It's like the fellows and the alums experience on like, here's what it did for me, here's what I gained, and here's how I want to pay it forward. That I think is the most powerful for our prospective fellows. So we're at a point now where we have around 400, a little under, but close to 400 alumni, all identifying as Black or Latina,
Right.
Early career software engineers, data analysts, mechanical engineers in Boston, and are now some of our more senior alumni are now in positions of interviewing in people management and bringing folks on themselves. And that to me is systems change, where the communities are in that position of power,
Sure.
that they can sustain that and influence systems and processes within the organization. So that's what we hope to see continue to see with our alumni base and the power that they are able to elevate into.
And you mentioned the non-alternative education paths, right? So whether they be training-oriented, skills-oriented, boot camps, community college, state, we're at a state university right now,
Yes,
right?
yes.
A big feeder into the state university is the community college path. So many students enter community college, then go from their community college degree coming into this university. It's a very, very common path. Was that always core to the mission at Hack Diversity as part of how you thought about sort of the types of individuals you want to engage with? It sounds like it was core to the mission from the beginning.
Absolutely, from
Yeah.
the get-go. We were always interested in how do we highlight and spotlight those education pathways are undervalued. And I think especially if you're looking at where are the education programs that are most accessible to Black and Latina communities based on, even way before the higher education level, right? Public school districting, access to housing, all of those factors compound towards access to higher education. And if you look at where the biggest communities and pockets of Black and Latina communities are gaining their education or have access to education, especially STEM education.
Right.
It is in those community
avenues.
community colleges, public institutions, state institutions, less so the private institutions.
Right.
Because if you think about like an employer and they're thinking about, hey, I only want to consider MIT candidates.
Right.
Of course, MIT candidates are great, right?
Sure.
There's a reason
Right.
that they're
They went to MIT.
constantly,
Yeah.
MIT top-ranked school by a bunch of lists, right?
Right.
But if you're thinking about, is MIT the only place that has great talent? No. And
Right.
in the pathway to even, get tutors for an SAT score, there's a lot of, and then you think about all those little kind of blockers throughout an entire person's career or education trajectory. The fact that you might be prematurely dismissing a candidate who might not have that on their resume is, I think, very counterintuitive to a goal of racial inclusion.
Right. I'm going to zoom out again a little bit. We're going to go high and low, I think, a bunch, which is great, right? So.
Just follow your lead.
Okay. We'll try not to go into the river, but I think we think about sort of the three pillars of DEI program, right? So hiring, learning and development, and employee experience, right? It's kind of the three pillars. Sounds, like Hack Diversity is taking some very integrative and interesting approaches to those. So I'm curious as to whether you think, those kind of tried and true pillars of like, we're going to hire the rights, we're going to do the right thing when it comes to hiring, we're going to do the right thing when it comes to learning and development, we're going to do the right thing when it comes to employee experience as it pertains to inclusion, diversity, and equity. But is that enough, Angela? Because, they're kind of the tried and true pillars, but we live in a fluid society. There's a lot that happens from a dynamic. So how do you stay in touch with, the changes and make sure that you're incorporating those into hiring, into, learning and development, into employee experience? And should there be more being done beyond those three pillars? So I know it's kind of a compound question, but we can break that down. So
I think there's always more you can do.
to be done, yeah.
Always with anything.
Yeah.
And I think the way Hack Diversity's philosophy and DEI is something that should be sustained. It's not a goal that can be met, per se.
Sure.
It's how, I think, maybe the analogy that comes to mind is like a medical school, or medical license, or like a legal, like a bar, if you're a lawyer, you regularly have to get recertified just because you need to be kept
Continuing
up to date.
education,
Right,
continuing
exactly.
certification.
So to me, and I'm just speaking from my perspective, and
Sure.
this is kind of maybe the philosophy I inject into Hack as well, and how I think collectively as an organization we think about like how and also we ourselves are by no means saying we're experts.
Right.
Like we're constantly right now doing work on ourselves to make sure that we're practicing what we
What you
preach,
preach.
modeling
Sure.
what we're asking our employer partners to do, and we're constantly checking ourselves and learning ourselves and doing that level, those three layers I mentioned: the individual learning, the interpersonal learning, and communication and feedback, and then as an organization, what kind of culture we want to codify in our processes, especially as we continue to expand. Because something I've learned, because I was the first hire at Hack Diversity, so right now we're a team of close to 20.
Right.
Something that has been really a growing opportunity for me is realizing that a culture when we were five people
It's very different than
feels
15 than 20.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how does our culture maintain the integrity of our values, which should ground all of us in the mission,
Right.
But also be responsive to the complementary strengths of new members of their team or our team
That come in, whether they be new fellows, new employee partners,
Right,
new
exactly.
employees that hack diversity hires.
Yeah. So to me, it's a living and breathing entity that
Right.
you constantly have to maintain and sustain. And like I mentioned at the top of this conversation, having cycles of call and response and feedback, and making sure we're auditing, self-auditing, and not being lazy is not the right term.
Complacent, maybe.
Okay, complacent,
Yeah,
exactly
yeah,
that. Oh yeah, we're figuring that out. We don't
Right.
need to think about that anymore, because even if we think we're talking about like Black and Latina, and even like Asian, I identify as, I apologize, I keep hitting my microphone. I identify as Asian American, specifically Chinese American, and specifically like kind of first generation. So I am very conscious that I am someone who doesn't identify as Black or Latina.
Right.
And I have the privilege and the responsibility to
Work
represent
at,
that community. And my credibility and how I think about myself is all in the. I will do this as long as our alumni are saying I'm doing a good job.
Right.
But ultimately, it's when we're thinking about like allyship and how we maintain our individual learning and progress. I think it's important that you're always looking to, okay, I can't claim that I'm an ally. It needs to be awarded to me.
Right.
By,
You have to earn it.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So related to culture and hiring, learning development, and what was the last?
Employee experience.
Yeah, I think that's a living,
Breathing thing. Yeah.
And I know that's like not like a great answer because it is like vague.
No, it's a
and
good
kind
answer.
of,
No, it's good. Well, and I want to double click on something you said a second ago. We're in a room full of educators, right, and lifelong learners, and in the experiential aspect of it. And you were talking for a brief second about how you have to think about how people learn, right, and be sensitive to the way that they learn. And is that part of what you advise your organizations that work with you on? Is like, look, not everybody consumes information in the same way, and what worked here isn't necessarily going to work there, and we have to kind of tailor that experiential learning piece of this. I'm assuming,
Yeah, absolutely. One thing we focus a lot on, and I have been trying to be more mindful, increasingly more mindful of, is the concept of consent, and because. Especially when we're talking about race and identity, those are really vulnerable and conversations, right? Regardless of what you identify as, because ultimately, if you're engaged in this work, you have positive intent, but there is a big difference between intent and impact, and ultimately, how do you balance centering the impact?
How do you not get lost along the way?
Yeah, and then but also feel like you're. And also having a safe space to potentially say the wrong thing, and know that that's a learning opportunity, and have humility as a recipient, have humility as a person giving the statement, have humility to learn and process together, and going through cycles of healing and learning and giving each other grace, but then ultimately recentering to, hey, our goal. If our goal
Here's
is,
our goal. Yeah.
If our goal is inclusion. Where we kind of how can we be mindful of giving and taking around different people's experiences between impact and intent?
Interesting. Yeah.
I don't know if this is like this version like philosophical.
No, I'm super curious about the learning aspect of it, because again, you mentioned the vulnerability, you mentioned the consent. Let's face it, sometimes within organizations you talk about producing these types of programs, and sometimes the reaction is like, I don't want to do that, right? Or I will do that, but I have to do it under only these certain circumstances or in these terms. So I'm curious as to how you advise organizations to say, look, there's not a one size fits all here. It's not like put everybody in a room, put on a video, or have a speaker come in or whatever. There's a tailoring to this, right? That I was interested in your perspective on.
Right. Yeah, and I guess maybe an example is your hiring, learning development, employee experience. There isn't like a right.
There's no straight,
right.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times a fallacy that I observe is companies are so focused on finding the perfect strategy, but then they're not able to move forward. So
Yeah,
how
they
do you
kinda
make
get
sure
stalled in that, like,
perfect isn't
paralysis.
the enemy of the good?
Yeah.
Type of
Yeah.
thing. Just pick a point,
Mhm.
start it, and iterate upon
Mhm.
it as you would any product
Right.
that you're putting out there, right? And I think as long as you're being transparent and honest to your employees about that, like people respond, right? As long as you're taking feedback, implementing, incorporating, people will see that.
Right. As good
and-
intent. As
Right,
good.
right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
with our partners, I would say there's no one. I wouldn't say there's anybody. Even our partners, they wouldn't say, "Oh yeah, we've got this. We figured it out." I think different partners are right now amongst our most recent cohort. Our coalition of partners was 32. Some are doing really well, or from the fellows' feedback,
Right.
are stronger in the hiring piece of it. Some are stronger in the employee experience. Some are stronger in the learning and development. But I wouldn't say that there's kind of someone across the board
yeah.
that has
Sure.
because also like you can't do everything at once.
Right.
You have to start somewhere.
You have to
invest your energy,
prioritize. Yeah.
And then figure out how to build. From
Where are
there.
the points area that you're trying to raise the water on first, second,
Right.
third, right? Yeah. And so your fellows really act as an arbiter to that, then, if you will.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's
interesting.
something we
Yeah.
try to do. Be very mindful of how do we center the fellows' experience and how we think about growing the program. In incorporating our improvements to their curriculum as it relates to tech skills training, but also the employer's curriculum in their racial equity, diversity, inclusion, professional development themselves as people, as like positional power folks, right? Because fellows are coming in as not only maybe underrepresented from an identity lens
Right.
in tech. There's across Boston, 3%
Sure.
of tech employees are Black.
Yeah.
Right. So, but also they're coming at the I guess lowest rung of positional power in an organization as an intern. Right.
Right.
So how do you make sure
The
that
power dynamic is not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And back to your question around responsibility, where is the division of responsibility? I do think at that onset of early career, managers especially managers in leadership organizational leadership should have the responsibility to take on, hey, I'm going to provide you with this roadmap
Right.
of how you can succeed here, and then I'm going to give you feedback related to that roadmap that we agreed upon, and not penalize you for something you might not have gained. But there's an assumption that like even things like
Well, assumptions are bad, right?
timeliness, right? or like having your camera on in a Zoom call.
Right.
Oftentimes we would ask, hey, have you given this feedback to the fellow?
Right.
And more often than not, that has not even occurred to
do that
employer.
feedback loop,
And it's
yeah.
not from a malice, right? It's
Right.
not like a ill will
Hey, what are you
or
doing?
intention.
Right.
But there's an immediate assumption of like, oh, this person's not paying attention. Like, why don't
Right.
they turn this?
Why aren't they
Yeah.
more engaged? Yeah.
Right.
Right.
But even that definition of engagement needs to be parsed out.
Right.
Because you don't realize how much is kind of gained through social capital and maybe in the environment that you've been exposed to.
Sure. Yep.
And when you're coming from an angle where there's a lot less resources, that might not be built into the transition to a professional environment.
Right.
And that's something we build into HAP, like how preparing folks.
How do you prepare people for that transition
Yeah.
into the professional environment?
Right.
Yeah.
For the fellows, so that they feel most confident
Right.
entering into these environments and that they have a place there.
Right. And they're getting what the experience that you hope that they would get out of this.
Right,
For sure.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And remind me again, how long is the average fellow program?
It's a 9-month cycle.
9 months. Okay. I think
Yeah.
you said that earlier, but
Yeah,
9
yeah.
months. Okay.
So the first 3 months or so is direct programming. The best
Yep.
fellows complete technical team projects. They complete professional development. They are introduced to all the employer partners so that they have opportunities.
To work with. Yeah.
Then they go
Yeah.
through an interview process with employer partners, and then they get matched into an internship. And then over the summer, a minimum of 12 weeks,
Okay.
they complete paid internships.
Mhm.
And then once we match the fellows into the company, they're direct employees of the partner.
Of the partner. Yep.
And the partner has full weight and freedom to design the experience, but HAC maintains support and accountability partnership on both ends to make sure folks are meeting their goals.
People are
that we
working
laid
to
out.
what they're supposed to be working towards.
Yeah,
Yep.
and we're maximizing
Right.
opportunity to be retained.
Right.
Because that's ultimately our goal.
Mhm.
We're not as interested in just internship matching and then folks are cycling out of the industry.
Right.
We want to make sure
Once
that
people
folks
stay in it.
are retained in the
Right.
industry and have opportunity to elevate and grow into decision-making opportunities within the company.
What's the success rate on the fellowship? Do most individuals who enter the 9-month fellowship, do they tend to complete? Do you have a high participation and success rate?
We do.
Yeah.
So we over the pandemic years, I will say we had a lot more attrition.
Sure.
And mostly it's due to, as you can imagine, like life.
People had significant life events during the pandemic.
Yeah. So, but the folks who enter into, so this past year we selected 130 fellows into our cohort. By the time we reached interviews, we had I think around a little over 110 fellows matching to internships, and then most of them, I would say 99.9% completed.
Wow.
There was one exception due to extenuating life circumstance.
Sure.
But and then that's pretty consistent over the past 6 cycles of our program. And then in regards to being retained, or at least or if not by the host company for a permanent position, we work with them to find permanent employment elsewhere in the ecosystem.
Yep.
In our timeline for permanent position, about half our fellows every year are ready to enter the workforce immediately post internship.
Yep.
Meaning that they graduated from whatever program they're getting their technical foundation through, and then the other half actually are returning to school because they're either needing to complete a few semesters, or they completed their associate's degree and are going to get their bachelor's degree. So some kind of continuing education. But once they're alumni, as long as they're in good standing, meaning they are respecting our values,
your values,
and community
the things
respect,
they kind of agree to,
and not doing any sort of harm with regards to HR practices, they are retaining access to hack resources for life.
For life.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And the coolest thing for me to see is how our alumni community has been a powerful network amongst themselves.
In and of its own, right?
So we have fellows now who are in position, working at Microsoft, working at Snapchat, working at GitHub, and those weren't our partners, but are now being able to refer into those.
Right, so it's a nice virtuous cycle of what happens there.
Right.
Yeah. And it has to be very rewarding as well as interesting for you from a perspective of 10 years, right? Employee number 1, 10 years.
Yeah. Oh, no, not 10 years at Hack. Like 10 years throughout my directory.
Okay.
Yes.
But even
6
then,
years.
6 years, okay, so 6 years, that's still half a decade or more than half a decade to see that evolution, right? From, hey, we weren't working with Microsoft, but through our alumni network, this has happened.
Yeah.
The dynamics of that changing over the last 6 years must be really, really special to see.
I think it's, for me personally, it's just like more of I truly feel like an honor that fellows entrust in me and the hacking.
Well, it's a major thing to entrust to hack kind of,
A cool data point. So we started on a longitudinal study, a 5-year longitudinal study with a third-party evaluator, where we look at hack performance and hack economic outcomes versus the control group of similar educated demographics, right? Both the overall working age in Massachusetts, and also racial, kind of the data points of racial, education, age, affinity with the cohort, and our fellows have a stronger perception of racial equity, inclusiveness amongst our host company partners than they do of the tech industry at large.
Wow.
So I do think.
So that's an outcome you were certainly hoping for.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That, and also an earning potential.
Right.
Our fellows have a significant portion of our fellows are earning higher than 75K compared to the control groups of similar age, demographic, identity.
Wherever they are in their career trajectory.
Right. Yeah. And this is a 5-year study that we committed to, so we're in year 2 right now of that. And hopefully, so what I'm sharing with you was year 1 data, so that's what was really promising. Obviously, something can.
We'll see what happens. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
But we were very excited to see that comparison between, because we were thinking, okay, this is what we're thinking. We're making change around our fellows, but being able to see this on paper as a data point against a control group was really really cool.
Yeah. Is that something that you guys are doing completely on your own, or maybe you can't talk about the partnership, but is there a partner associated with that? Yeah,
we have a third-party evaluator.
Okay.
Third-party evaluator is BW Research.
Okay.
And they have they specialize in workforce studies.
Okay, very cool. Yeah. Zooming out again, right? So, because there's a lot of folks in this room and online that don't have the benefit of potentially been a hack diversity partner, and they're going through their programs within their own organizations. And I want to talk a little bit about affinity groups, right? And for folks, that aren't familiar with affinity groups, essentially we're talking about when an organization creates an opportunity for employees to sort of self-identify in a particular area, right? And then create these affinity groups around, we want to share everyday experiences together. We want to have a sense of belonging. We want to promote a sense of community, whatnot. So, and I think a lot of organizations have affinity groups today, right?
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your take on affinity groups. If there's anything that we need to be concerned about as it pertains to affinity groups. And maybe it's something that Hack Diversity does even within its own organization. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I personally think affinity groups are great if done well.
Sure.
But then there's I think pitfalls that can happen.
Yeah.
So I do know one of the things we ask that we track is the correlation of belonging, fellows' feelings of experience of belonging with affinity groups, and if they have that visibility at their companies or if they
Sure.
are able to participate. So there is a correlation. We don't have enough data to say this is a
This is an exact causal effect relationship.
but
Yeah.
we see a correlation on it does uptake feelings of belonging if fellows are able, or at the very minimum, have visibility into
the fact there's an affinity
there's
group.
an option for me to join this
Right,
group
right.
At this company. And the reason my caveat I think we have to be careful about is, are we asked? I think it's one thing if we're creating these safe spaces for like identifying folks to
Sure.
be able to share experiences, maybe share more honestly than they might feel
Would
comfortable
otherwise.
in a
Sure.
team-wide meeting.
Right.
And it's just I think it's great if it's just like a safe space, people can talk and join and have honest conversations and maybe consider recommendations, right?
Mhm.
But I think it's another thing if leadership is expecting these affinity groups to solve a
Problem within the organization.
that
Yeah.
they are not, that is either not reflected in their goals or they're not being compensated for.
Sure.
So I think if an employer is thinking about, okay, we want to leverage these affinity groups to propose solutions to challenges that we're experiencing around inclusion, I do think there needs to be a level of recognition to the work and effort of these communities, especially if you're asking Black communities to solve a problem that ultimately I think it needs to be like an inclusive
Right.
solutions
Right.
problem.
It's not fair
it's not
to
like
put
a-
it on the affinity
Right,
group
right,
to say,
exactly.
go solve this. Yeah.
Exactly, because
Yeah.
those folks are already experiencing the burden of
Right.
we already feel
Right.
like I had to work twice as hard to achieve the same level of recognition. So I think if the intention for affinity groups is, oh, we want you to propose and we want to hear what you would do.
Right.
I think it's important that you're equipping that team with a budget, putting it into their goals so that they're recognized as part of performance reviews.
That's an interesting component that I certainly haven't seen, right? So I've worked in a lot of corporate environments where we've had affinity groups for all different sorts of marginalized or however folks identify into those groups. But I haven't seen the tie back to your point around either IDP or part of performance goals. That's an interesting perspective. How do you see that kind of playing out?
Yeah, so to be transparent, currently in our Ready curriculum does not focus a lot on affinity groups right now. That's something we are thinking about implementing in next year's of programming to enhance. And our amazing racial equity, diversity, inclusion director is ideating around that. But as of right now, just through kind of qualitative conversation, I also don't see a lot of that tie-in.
Sure.
It is more of a space for folks to enter into and be able to converse, but to what extent it ties back into organizational goals, haven't seen a ton of that. But it's also I don't think it necessarily needs to happen if you're not tasking folks to solve an organization problem.
Right.
If it's just a safe space, and
Then that's okay.
and
You don't need to maybe overcomplicate it.
It's
in
more
that
like
way.
a socializing aspect that helps belonging. Great.
That's great.
But if it's this is a business strategy goal, KPI, I do think it's important to codify and recognize and reward folks who meet that goal on behalf of the organization.
That's interesting because I think some organizations will say, "Oh, our affinity groups are a key to our success as a business," but the focus is more on maybe the socializing and the belonging aspect of it, and less kind of tying it to, well, what do you mean when you say this is key to our success as a business, right? How does this influence our values as a business? How does this influence the decisions that we make as a business, the things we decide to invest in, not invest in, right? How we build our employee base, how we build which investors we want to work with, right? So I haven't really thought of it that way, so that's interesting. I appreciate that perspective a lot. Yeah.
Great, and I also want to note that this is just me.
Yeah, sure.
I don't have a lot of data fully to back it up, and we do pride ourselves on a data-driven decision-making organization. So just sharing my thoughts. And my perspective and observations.
Yeah, sure. So before we kind of get towards the interactive aspect of this and ask folks for questions, I do want to talk to you a little bit about, the future aspect of this, right? So, and you and I talked a little bit about this last week when we were kind of saying, if you think about some of if we were to view DEI initiatives as sort of on a timeline, right? And things that have kind of happened, major milestones associated with those, and work that was done originally more so in the harassment space, sexual harassment, other types of grievance policies and procedures that needed to exist at companies that didn't exist before. Then we kind of saw the improvements around health benefits and offering health benefits for domestic partners or other things like that. We saw extending family and maternity leaves. We saw ungendering job applications. I went through a big initiative at my last company to really work hard around ungendering job applications or job descriptions. Expanding paid time off for things around observability for religious holidays and those kinds of things. So when you think about that progression, right, what's left to do? And what do you think are sort of the emerging things that are on the fray that we need to start paying attention to that we're not paying attention to yet, Angela?
Yeah, I think there's a lot
a ton,
to do,
right? Sure.
But I think the low-hanging fruit that we're already seeing as how folks or organizations and individuals are navigating out of the pandemic, I do think the in-person, and I'm speaking, this is very much like quote-unquote knowledge work type of, I think this is, if you're talking about labor work, and both my parents are blue collar. Sure. So like this would not apply to them. Like they would not be able to create their own hours and have like flexibility. But I do think from in the tech space,
it's very different.
We're seeing even our employer partners are trying to move back into more in person and getting a lot of pushback. And how can we be thinking about re-incentivizing, if it's important to an employer to have folks in person, how do you re-incentivize in new ways?
The carrot approach, not the stick approach of you will return and you will be here, you will show up.
It can't just be like, oh, we're just returning back to normal, because that no longer is normal. This is the new normal. The flexibility to work from home or to work from an environment of your choosing. Or the very minimum, be able to elect when you want to go into the office and not be required to go
do
into
so.
the office.
And
I think also employers are realizing this allows for more dispersed teams, which actually, if you're looking at inclusion, maybe is more accessible to Black, Latina, and Indigenous employees and candidates, right? Because if you look at where geographically, pockets of access
geographically,
to tech companies and the cost of living around those hubs. So I think that like blurring and dispersed teams is something we're already seeing.
It's here, right? It was on the horizon, now it's here.
Right. And I think adoption has already been full underway. And I also think the other thing which HACK pushes on, has been pushing on ever since inception, is the removal of degrees from prematurely from filtering out candidates. So there's an initiative right now called that recently I think became public, led by Opportunity at Work, called Tear Down the Paper Ceiling, which is that the whole concept of requiring a 4-year degree in order to be eligible for certain roles that don't need a 4-year degree, as long as it is skills-oriented
opportunity.
Which I think software engineering and a lot of the career tracks that HACK focuses on is very squarely in. Like someone can be a really great software engineer without needing.
They know the programming languages. They know how to take complex problems and break them down. And
There's so many free open source resources out there that people can gain their education and not go into ton debt
Right, to do that.
to gain.
Yeah.
So I think I do think we're going to see a big
Right.
shift, especially in tech companies around removing the 4-year
Yeah.
degree as a prerequisite to being eligible.
Next podcast conversation for you and I, we're gonna talk about the disruption of higher education.
Yeah, that's another soapbox of mine. So
Yeah, absolutely.
love that,
Good.
yeah.
Well, I know we're going to come close to time, so I will ask, is it Stephanie or Mina who's going to maybe help a little bit with facilitating any questions that we might have from the audience here live or anything that's popped up online. So, any questions for Angela?
And I'll just say thank you so much, Richard and Angela. That was really exciting and interesting, and I feel like we could just keep going on and on and on because there's so much. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Angela, this has been great so far. My question comes from being in an immigrant home and my parents, moving here and having expectations for academic greatness or, just greatness from I did this for you, you need to do this for me. What's the best way to really respect that mindset, from your older generation, but then also be able to make really your own path?
Oh man, I feel like that's such a loaded question that brings my relationship with my parents in the conversation. I think when Hack saying 4-year degree should not be a prerequisite to earn a living in a well-compensated job, we're not saying by any means that education is not important. It's more like they're being open to considering that someone can be qualified and can do a really good job in this role without going through these predetermined pathways of success that ultimately was created is created from a system that does not serve the communities that Hack focuses on, Black and Latino communities, right? So, and our fellows, for the most part of them, they have aspirations to get their master's degree, to get their doctorates, and to continue their education. Like our fellows are learners, and they're hungry, but they're wanting an opportunity to get in the door without needing to again go into debt to be seen as qualified, because those things are very much not mutually exclusive. I'm not sure that answers your question. But yeah, my mom has been trying to push me to get more degrees by my name.
Did anybody else have a question? Did we have anything in the chat? Yeah, you got one?
Yeah, I do have one. Thank you. Hi, Angela, and thank you for sharing about your story and your experience. I would like to ask, what is your top memorable learning experience throughout your journey?
Ooh, at Hack? Oh man, I'm blanking. I have so many. But I always think it's humbling when you think you're really good at something, and then you get feedback that, there's a lot that I was not aware of from my narrow view in being able to practice my muscle, and this is something I constantly am working on, practice my muscle to sit with it and not immediately go into the defensive. Because I think especially in this work, again, talking about race, talking about identity, talking about belonging and constructive feedback, I think there's so often your natural reaction is to defend and try to convince the other person, and no, I had good intent, I promise, this, I didn't mean to harm, but really being able to sit back and listen to, hey, this is how it landed for you, and how can we work through and heal together and move forward. And then also not need to keep revisiting, right, and be able to truly move on and grow from there. So I think those moments, and I have a lot of those, are
A lot of growth moments.
yeah, exactly, yeah. And I'm glad for that. I think part of what we try to do at Hack, and hopefully every employer here wants to do, is you're surrounding yourself with people who are better than you, in areas that you're not as strong in, and you're learning from each other. So I think as a nature of that, there will always be moments of you're being checked, and vice versa, right? You're holding people accountable, and so does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, definitely, thank you. And we have 2 questions online. So one of the participants, they gave a background info. So they wrote, as a higher education professional working at an institution with 40% of students who are first generation and many of whom are Black Latins, their question was whether there's an opportunity to partner with colleges and universities to create pipelines to diversify the workforce.
So this is a high school.
A higher ed administrator.
What? Sorry, do you mind repeating that question? I think I
Looking
got
to
lost.
see how they can partner with, pipeline and partnering to hack diversity.
Yes, so.
Oh yeah. Contact me. happy to refer or have a conversation.
Okay, sounds good. So we have one more question. And the question is, what practices and advice do you have for organizations to build diversity and equity vertically through their org and specifically in their leadership teams?
Oof. These are very complex questions. I do think it's important to identify an assessment of where you're at first, and what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to think of it through a quota system, which probably isn't the best way, maybe, but like just understanding a level of what is your current understanding of knowledge and education around racial equity practices. And I think starting from there is the baseline, like doing a level of audit and assessment, and then also getting buy-in from maybe your board, and then also being able to workshop with a few select individuals across teams before going all in. I do think, and this is something I work on a lot. I've been told that I move too urgently and I need to slow down. So I do think taking the time to understand what the problem is before you try to move forward and wanting to solve everything at the same time is the way to go, because it's unrealistic to solve like a centuries-old problem in 9 months even, with hack, right? So, yeah.
All right, I'll ask one last question, and it may be one you don't want to answer, but maybe you can. Who's doing it really well? Like, what company that you've worked with is doing this well and is a model and is something that we should all look at as, you know, where we should strive to be in this space?
Yeah, I can answer that, but I wouldn't say anybody's like doing it really well. I do think, I'm saying that I don't think our company partners would say they're doing it really well. But if I'm looking at it from fellows' feedback on experiences of belonging, Liberty Mutual has been a partner of ours for going on maybe, they were a partner since 2018, I believe. So however many years that is, 5 years, 6 years, 4 years? Yeah. But they've had consistently hired 15 plus fellows of ours, has always like shown up to our racial equity, diversity, inclusion programming, has always given us feedback, has always been honest with us and receptive when we give feedback. And our fellows, if we're looking at across the 15 year over year, a critical mass of them say that they feel a lot of belonging, both in their experience, but also in overall company initiatives and pushes. And I remember pretty strongly when the George Floyd killing happened, Liberty Mutual was one of the first companies to really commit a lot of money to the broader conversation. So that's one that comes to mind.
That's great.
Great, that's pretty simple. Do you have one more? Yeah. Okay.
Hi. So as a white male, when it comes to diversity, I always think, you know, I don't need to talk, I need to listen. You know, what more can I do? Especially when it comes to like attracting talent into a company.
I think, first of all, thank you for that question, and thank you for being brave enough to ask that question. I think oftentimes white men are wanting to not, in the effort to not take up space, maybe there were, I say there, I don't want to say us versus that, but maybe there's an opportunity to see yourself as part of the solution as well, because we need white men, right? Like the advocacy of white men, the championship of white men, the sponsorship of white men, like it's so powerful for you to be like, hey, for example, if you're invited to a panel, ask about who are the other panelists. Is it possible, I would love to attend, but can I bring someone who might be a Latina woman with me to be on the panel as well? Like stuff like that, I think is very easily doable things that make a big difference in visibility and credibility, and also giving space for leadership opportunities for those underrepresented communities. So thank you for like engaging in this conversation and participating in that work within your organization.
I think we had one more question online.
From online, yes. All right, we have one last question from online. So, in order to facilitate diversity in the workforce, are there any other national organizations or groups you would recommend partnering with?
Oh yeah, definitely. There's so many. I think some one that is we find a lot of inspiration from is Code 2040, AI for All, for Scholas, the Marcy Lab in New York. Something that's newer to us, but we're really big fans of what they're doing. So there's a lot of organizations. On our website, the Have Diversity website, we have a whole page of mission-aligned organizations that you can look into that does affinity work with Have Diversity. And these aren't organizations that we have direct partnerships with, but we're just like fans of what they're doing, and they're serving communities that are either similar to HAC or a different segment of HAC. So for example, HAC currently does not focus on indigenous communities, but we have organizations within that list that does. Same with Asian communities, same with LGBTQ communities. That's currently not HAC's focus and our mission, but we want to redirect folks to other organizations doing great work in collaboration or in coalition for like the larger conversation around inclusivity. So,
All right, any final thoughts as we wrap up?
Thank you. Thanks, Stephanie. Just before we go, you're expanding your work beyond Boston now, right? So Hack Diversity is into New York City, right?
Yeah, so we're moving to New York City,
Yep.
and a quick call to action, if anybody online or here has relationships in New York City and thinks that they would find value in learning more about HAC and how HAC can be additive to racial equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives as it relates to business strategy or talent acquisition, please let me know. We can maybe include my contact information in the podcast showing. And also, if folks are maybe not ready to commit to formal employer partnership, if you individually have 5 hours a month to dedicate to a pay-it-forward opportunity throughout the cycle of the HAC program from January to September, again, it's a maximum of 5 hours a month, but if you want to pay it forward, it's a really low lift, I think really high impact and reward experience to get a sense of who our fellows are, and you'll understand why it's the easiest thing to advocate for.
You're right. Thank you. That's a great call to action. So before we wrap, just want to say thank you once again to the Office of Alumni Relations, the UMASS Lowell iHub for hosting us with this really important conversation. And folks, give it up, Angela Liu. Everybody, Angela Liu.
Thank you for being there. Yeah, thank you to you.